Luke 2:41 to 52. Every year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. When he was 12 years old, they went up to the festival according to the custom. After the festival was over, while his parents were returning home, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but they were unaware of it. Thinking he was in their company, they traveled on for a day. Then they began looking for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they went back to Jerusalem to look for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. His mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." "Why were you searching for me?" he asked. "Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house?" But they did not understand what he was saying to them. Then he went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. But his mother treasured all these things in her heart. When Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. It is every parent's nightmare scenario. Jesus is 12 years old. Every year as a family, they travel all the way from Nazareth to Jerusalem for the Passover festival. Nazareth is on the northern tip of the province of Galilee. Jerusalem is about 90 miles south of Nazareth. There are no highways in those days. Mary and Joseph most likely traveled with an extended family caravan group with relatives and friends. This is also to make sure that they are safe from any bandits or robbers along the way. It is most likely a 3-day journey. Jesus is traveling with his aunts, uncles, and cousins. Mary and Joseph take it for granted that Jesus is with the caravan party. It is every parent's nightmare scenario. They have left Jerusalem a day ago. To their horror, Jesus is nowhere to be found in the caravan party. They return to Jerusalem to look for Jesus. This is so unlike Jesus. For the last 11 years, he would have stayed close to the family. That is probably why Mary and Joseph do not inquire if he is with the caravan party as they first leave Jerusalem. Mary and Joseph take 3 days to look for their 12-year-old boy. Finally, they find him. They do not find him in the fields playing with other children. They are grateful that they find him. Where do they find this 12-year-old? They find him in the courts of the massive Jerusalem temple. He is chatting with the temple teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. The temple teachers are astonished that a boy of 12 years can display such knowledge of the Old Testament scriptures. He seems to understand things that the teachers themselves, have difficulty understanding. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. His mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." "Why were you searching for me?" he asked. "Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house?" Luke 2:48 to 49. Jesus calls the Jerusalem temple his father's house. Our initial response would be, is there something wrong with this 12-year-old? He is claiming that God, the God who is worshipped at this temple, is his father. Let's face it, if we were to meet a 12-year-old today and they claim that God is their parent, we would think that there's something wrong mentally with that 12-year-old. The temple structure that Jesus refers to as his father's house no longer stands. After a 5-month siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD, the Romans burned this temple down to the ground. This was the biggest and most elaborate structure of a Jerusalem temple ever built. It was built by the highly egotistical King Herod, who killed all the baby boys of Bethlehem in Matthew 2. This physical temple, does not exist anymore. Therefore, where is God's temple today? Where is the house of God, the Father of Jesus? "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you. Why were you searching for me? Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house?" I have often wondered how Joseph would have felt when the 12-year-old Jesus makes this comment. "Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house?" This is the Joseph who sacrificed so much to legitimize Mary's situation when she is discovered to be pregnant with Jesus out of wedlock. It would have been a scandal in the village of Nazareth in those days. I often wonder how Jesus carries on as the son of Joseph, the carpenter in Nazareth, after this episode. Is there always tension between Jesus and Joseph? After all, Jesus declares that he is in his father's house at the temple. Does Jesus also say that he is in his father's house when he lives in the family home in Nazareth? Carol shares this story about growing up with her father who was distant. "My father left us when I was 6 years old. I never knew my dad as provider, protector, or promise keeper. He would promise my sisters and me that he would come down to see us on Saturday, then not show up. I remember once after we were grown, we made a date with him one Saturday to go out for dinner for our birthdays. We got all dressed up, and as you can guess, he did not show up. Because of my poor relationship with my earthly father, I had a hard time relating to God as my heavenly Father. I trusted that God could save me, but wondered, will God provide for me when I am lonely? Will God protect me from those who do me harm and from myself when I make bad decisions? Can I trust God's promises? Will God show up on Saturday? During the years of my Christian journey, I've come to realize that my dad is my dad and God is my God. I can trust my Creator with my triumphs, my trials, and my tears, and I thank God for the chance to live a more abundant life with God. Then he went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them, but his mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. Luke 2:51-52. Here in Luke 2, we have a story of the tension between the 12-year-old Jesus and his parents, Mary and Joseph. This is the only record of Jesus in the Gospels about Jesus as a boy. As we read the Christmas story, only Matthew and Luke provide us with stories of Jesus' childbirth. Matthew seems to tell the Christmas story from Joseph's perspective and Luke from Mary's perspective. It is only Luke who tells us what is going on in Mary's heart as well as in her head. Just before Luke reports that the shepherds returned to their fields to look after the sheep, Luke tells us this. But Mary treasured up all these things and pondered them in her heart. Luke 2:19. Now, just as Luke tells us that the 12-year-old Jesus returns as an obedient son to Nazareth, he says this. Then he went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. But his mother treasured all these things in her heart. Luke 2:51. At the beginning of Luke's gospel, Luke says this. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who were from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Luke 1:1-4. Church tradition tells us that Luke is a medical doctor. He does not put anything down in writing until he carefully investigates the matter with eyewitnesses. He does this research before he writes this orderly account for Theophilus. Twice, Luke tells us that Mary treasures these things about the baby Jesus in her heart. I believe that Luke interviews Mary before he writes his account of the birth of Jesus. He knows that Mary treasures these things in her heart because Mary shares her experiences with Luke as he does his research for the writing of his gospel. She ponders about these things even after Jesus ascends into heaven. The shepherd visited us in the stable in Bethlehem. It was exactly as the angel told them. I had wrapped the baby Jesus with cloths and placed him in the manger. After they visited, they woke the whole town of Bethlehem up and told them, the Messiah has arrived. He is wrapped in cloths and lying in the manger in the stable. Jesus told us that he had to be in his Father's house, the Jerusalem temple. However, after we returned to Nazareth, Jesus was obedient to us. He spent a lot of time with Joseph. Joseph taught him how to become a carpenter. Jesus knew that Joseph sacrificed a lot to help me as I carried Jesus in my womb. Joseph could have divorced me. However, Joseph kept his oath to God and helped me make that journey to Bethlehem. There was no way I could have brought Jesus into the world if it were not for Joseph's help. For Jesus, his father's house was the Jerusalem temple. However, in AD 70, the Romans burned that temple down to the ground. Therefore, we ask this question again. If the Jerusalem temple is burned down in 70 AD, where is God's temple today? In 1 Corinthians 3, Paul writes to the house churches of Corinth and explains where God's temple is. Jesus has ascended to heaven. Therefore, if Jesus is in heaven, where is God's temple? Where is the house of God, the Father of Jesus? 1 Corinthians 3, 16 to 17. Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple and that God's Spirit lives among you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy that person. For God's temple is sacred, and you together are that temple. God's temple is not a place. God's temple is the people. The church is not the steeple. The church is the people. Don't you know that you yourself are God's temple and that God's Spirit lives among you? It does not matter if you are online at home or that you are in person in the church facilities. You are God's temple. It does not matter if you grew up in the church or not. You are part of God's temple. God's temple consists of all kinds of people, whether online or at home, whether they grow up in the church or not, whether they are born in Canada or somewhere else. It takes all kinds of people to make up the church, God's temple. I came across this devotion written by someone who did not grow up in a church setting. A group in our church published an Advent booklet of daily readings to distribute to our church family. Members of the committee interviewed people in the congregation who shared their faith stories for each day. Many stories included the words, I grew up in the church, or some similar thought. I realized it would be easy for many readers to believe that growing up in the church is the primary way people learn about God. Having grown up in a non-Christian setting, however, made me want to share the good news that God reaches out to us whether we grow up in the church or not. Because people witness to me, I know God's love and can claim the same divine inheritance as those who were reared in Christian homes. No matter what our background, we stand before God as heirs through faith. What a glorious promise. When I sought God, God came to me. As a co-heir with other Christians, I too can know God's love. I can share in God's promises as my own. We are God's temple. The church is the people and not the steeple. It takes all kinds of people to make up the church, God's temple. We end this year still protecting ourselves from the pandemic. As the people who belong to God, God's temple, we look up to God for help in 2022. It does not matter where we come from, whether we grow up in the church or not. We face the new year with hope in God's grace. We are all facing the same pandemic. We look up to God for help in the new year. May God be with us in 2022. Amen.